Imagine needing $1 billion and deciding not to sell a single share of the company that made you rich. It sounds backwards. Most of us believe that when you need money, you sell something. You sell your old car. You sell investments. You cash out savings. But many of the richest people in America often do the exact opposite. Instead of selling their assets, they walk into a bank, borrow enormous amounts of money, and continue living as if nothing changed. No massive stock sales. No giant tax bills. No giving up ownership. So why would someone worth billions choose to take on debt instead of simply using the money they already have? The answer reveals one of the biggest differences between how ordinary people use money and how the wealthy think about it. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why borrowing can sometimes make someone even richer and why the same strategy can become incredibly dangerous if used the wrong way. Welcome to Money Explained Differently, where we uncover the hidden side of money and explain the financial stories most people never see. Picture a successful business owner named Michael. After 20 years of hard work, he builds a company that's now worth $200 million. Most people assume Michael has hundreds of millions sitting in a bank account. But he doesn't. Almost all of his wealth exists on paper. It's tied up in the value of his business. If someone offered to buy the company today, he could become incredibly wealthy overnight. But until then, most of his fortune is in cash. Now imagine Michael wants to buy a beach house for $15 million. His first instinct might be to sell part of his company. That seems logical. But selling comes with consequences. He gives up ownership. He may owe taxes on the profit. Investors may wonder why he's selling. Employees could become nervous. The market might even think he has lost confidence in his own company. Instead, a private bank offers another solution. Keep your business. Use it as collateral. We'll lend you the money. Michael keeps ownership, avoids selling, and walks away with cash. At first, this seems almost unfair. But this is where most people get surprised. The wealthy often see their assets as machines that produce future wealth. Selling part of that machine is something they avoid whenever possible. Think about owning an apartment building that keeps increasing in value while also generating rental income every month. If you suddenly need money, would you rather sell half the building? Or borrow against it while continuing to collect rent? Many wealthy investors choose the second option because they believe the building will be worth even more years later. Stocks work in a similar way. Imagine you own shares in a successful company that has been growing steadily for decades. If you sell today, you lose future growth on the shares you sold. But if you borrow instead, you keep every share working for you. The loan becomes temporary. The ownership remains permanent. This idea becomes even more powerful because of something many people overlook. Taxes. Suppose you bought shares decades ago for $10 million. Today they're worth $200 million. If you sell $50 million worth of stock, a large portion of that gain may be subject to capital gains taxes. The exact amount depends on many factors, including tax laws and individual circumstances, but the tax bill can be substantial. Now compare that with borrowing. Loan proceeds generally aren't treated as taxable income because they're expected to be repaid. That means borrowing can provide spending money without immediately triggering the same kind of tax event that selling an appreciated asset might create. Notice the difference. Selling converts an investment into taxable gains. Borrowing converts an asset into temporary cash while the investment stays in place. However, there is another side to this story. Borrowing is never free. Banks charge interest. And billionaires don't receive loans simply because they're rich. They receive them because they own valuable assets that banks believe are extremely likely to hold their value. Imagine lending someone $100 million. Would you rather lend it to someone with a regular paycheck? Or someone who owns billions of dollars in shares of highly successful companies? From the bank's perspective, the answer is obvious. Those assets become security for the loan. If the borrower fails to repay, the bank may have rights to the pledged assets. That dramatically lowers the lender's risk. This is why private banking works differently from the everyday loans most Americans experience. For many families, borrowing is based largely on income. For many ultra-wealthy borrowers, borrowing is often based on assets. That's an entirely different world. And it explains why the richest clients frequently receive lower interest rates than ordinary borrowers. Ironically, the people who need loans the least often qualify for the best ones. The biggest cost is not the one you can see. Let's imagine the stock market suddenly falls. Michael's company loses 40% of its value during a recession. Yesterday, the bank believed his collateral easily covered the loan. Today, things look different. The bank may require additional collateral or partial repayment. This is sometimes called a margin call or a collateral call, depending on the type of loan. Now Michael faces a difficult choice. He might have to sell assets at exactly the wrong time. Instead of choosing when to sell, the market forces his hand. History has shown that even very wealthy investors can face serious problems when too much borrowing meets falling asset prices. Debt magnifies both success and failure. That's why leverage is powerful, but never risk-free. What do you think? If you were extremely wealthy, would you borrow against your investments or sell part of them instead? Share your opinion in the comments. Now let's step away from billionaires for a moment. Because this idea isn't completely foreign to everyday Americans. Think about your home. Suppose you bought a house for $300,000. Years later it's worth $600,000. You haven't received $300,000 in cash. Your wealth increased, but it's trapped inside the property. Many homeowners eventually use home equity loans or home equity lines of credit to access part of that value without selling the house. It's a much smaller version of the same principle. The house stays yours. You receive cash. You repay the loan over time. Of course, your home is also your shelter, so borrowing against it carries real risks if you can't make the payments. But the underlying concept is remarkably similar. Assets can provide money without being sold. The same idea appears in business. Imagine a successful family-owned manufacturing company. Instead of selling part of the business every time it needs new equipment, it borrows. The machines help produce more goods. Higher profits eventually repay the loan. Ownership remains with the family. Debt, when carefully managed, becomes a tool rather than a burden. This is one reason businesses borrow even when they have valuable assets. Sometimes preserving ownership creates more long-term value than selling pieces of the company. But there is another reason billionaires often avoid selling. Control. Suppose a founder owns 55% of a company. Selling enough shares to raise cash could reduce that ownership. Eventually, they may lose voting power. That means less influence over decisions, strategy, leadership, and the company's future. Borrowing allows them to access liquidity while maintaining control. For founders who spent decades building a business, keeping that control can be worth far more than avoiding interest payments. Another hidden factor is timing. Markets move in cycles. Selling during a downturn permanently locks in lower prices. Borrowing gives investors time. If they believe their assets will recover, they may prefer waiting rather than selling during temporary weakness. Of course, this only works if they can comfortably handle the loan. Time is one of the most valuable advantages an investor can have. Borrowing can sometimes buy more time. But this strategy also depends on discipline. Some wealthy people borrow to invest in productive businesses, purchase appreciating assets, or solve temporary cash flow needs. Others borrow simply to fund luxury lifestyles. The difference matters. One creates future income. The other creates future bills. Debt itself isn't good or bad. Its impact depends on what it's used for. This distinction applies to everyone, not just billionaires. Think about a student loan that helps someone qualify for a higher-paying career. Compare that with carrying expensive credit card balances to pay for vacations and shopping. Both involve borrowing. Only one has a reasonable chance of creating greater financial strength. That's why understanding the purpose behind debt is more important than simply looking at the debt itself. Another piece of the puzzle involves patience. Many of the world's wealthiest people think in decades instead of months. If they believe an asset will continue growing for another 20 years, selling today may feel like cutting down a tree that's still producing fruit. Borrowing allows them to enjoy some of today's value while keeping tomorrow's growth potential. That mindset is very different from viewing investments as something to constantly buy and sell. Yet there's one final detail that often gets overlooked. Paper wealth isn't the same as spending money. Someone can appear on a list of the richest people in America while having relatively little cash available compared with their net worth. Much of that wealth may be tied up in businesses, real estate, or company shares. Borrowing converts some of that paper wealth into usable cash without permanently giving up the assets that created it. That's why headlines about billionaire wealth can sometimes be misleading. Being worth billions doesn't necessarily mean having billions sitting in a bank account. It often means owning things that have become incredibly valuable. And those valuable assets can become the foundation for borrowing. Still, none of this means borrowing is a magic trick. Interest costs add up. Asset values can fall. Banks can tighten lending standards. Economic conditions change. The strategy works best for people with diversified assets, stable financial positions, and the ability to withstand unexpected setbacks. For everyone else, borrowing too aggressively can become one of the fastest paths toward financial trouble. The real lesson isn't that everyone should copy billionaires. It's understanding why they make the choices they do. They often treat ownership as something to protect. They think carefully about taxes. They understand the value of keeping investments working. And they recognize that cash flow and wealth are not always the same thing. Money isn't just about how much you own. It's about how you manage what you own. Sometimes selling is the smartest decision. Sometimes borrowing is. The difference lies in understanding the long-term consequences instead of focusing only on today's cash. And that's the hidden truth behind one of the most misunderstood financial habits of the ultra-wealthy. They don't borrow because they're short on money. They borrow because, in the right circumstances, keeping valuable assets can be worth far more than selling them. If you want to discover more hidden truths about money, subscribe to Money Explained Differently. We explore the financial stories behind the decisions that shape everyday life. Because once you understand how money really works, you begin to see the financial world in a completely different way.